Hey guys, and welcome to another video. The topic of today is, if you're building a retro gaming PC, should you go with a period correct machine, or what about a time machine? So period correct is all about having a CRT monitor, mechanical hard drive that makes all those hard drive seeking noises, whereas the other camp that likes building a time machine, well, we want some modern conveniences, a SSD that's nice and fast, doesn't make too much noise, or using a modern USB joystick, and of course, better performance to enjoy our older games. On the screen, we have a few computer builds from my Patreons that they shared on our Discord server, and the variety is really interesting. We have period correct retro PCs with that CRT monitor, but we also have modern time machines with beautiful cooling, LED light effects, and yeah, the variety of the projects and the machines is just really interesting. I put together two machines, two systems, one period correct, the other one our time machine. The period correct one is a slot A system with an Athlon 700. We have a GeForce 2, a Sound Blaster AW64 for DOS, and also a Sound Blaster Live, as well as a mechanical hard drive, a typical system from the year 2000. For our time machine, we've got an Athlon 64, so a much more modern platform. For the graphics, a GeForce FX, we've got a Audigy 2 ZS for the sound card, and also for storage, we are upgrading to SSD. To help us along, we will be referring to the July edition of the PC Player magazine from the year 2000. Me looking at these magazines, it's a real trip down memory lane, and looking at the prices of these old components, yeah, it really takes us back. But it also helps us structure this video a little bit. And the main game that I've been playing on both of these machines is Tachyon the Fringe. So I have some real world experience now comparing how this game runs on a period correct machine compared to having something a little bit more modern. Let's start looking at motherboards. Firstly, availability. The PC industry, well, every year it grew, more products were manufactured, and that's why the more modern the motherboard, the easier it is to find one on the used market. So a slot A motherboard, you will have a harder time finding one compared to one for Athlon 64. This also has an effect on prices. The reason many go down the route of a time machine is because the parts are more affordable. Now, in terms of build quality, and this is actually, yeah, quite surprising to some of you, I find that the older mainboards are actually built to a higher quality standard. I mean, this is a really beautiful mainboard. And the capacitors, for example, they're all Japanese, they're from Sanyo, so the build quality is really good. Whereas a lot of the mainboards from the Athlon 64 era, they were manufactured during the period of the capacitor plague, and very often you actually have to replace the capacitors. And yeah, that's firstly time consuming. You need some equipment, but you also need to buy replacement capacitors. So this sometimes actually ends up costing the same in terms of how much it costs to obtain these mainboards. There are differences when it comes to the BIOS. With an Athlon 64, we get more modern versions, and a good example is support for larger hard drives. On a period machine, you often have hard drive capacity limitations. 32 gigabyte is a classic one, whereas on the Athlon 64, well, you can use a terabyte hard drive and Windows XP without any issues. There are differences when it comes to the AGP port. So we can see here there are two notches here, and then we can look at the motherboard. There's one on the left side on this main board, whereas on the Athlon 64 the notch is on the right side. And this is quite important. That has to do with the voltage, 3.3 or 1.5 volts. And in short, what that means is certain older video cards like a Voodoo 3 AGP, they will not be compatible with the Athlon 64. For those video cards, you need an older mainboard that has the older AGP port. With the Time Machine, we're getting more and more advanced interfaces. For example, we're getting 4 USB ports, and that can be, yeah, quite important. If you only have 2 USB ports and you use a USB keyboard and a USB mouse, then yeah, you can't plug in a joystick and you need a hub. So also the speed, we're getting USB 2 on such a platform, much faster copying from a thumb drive. Another difference is the storage controller. On the Athlon 64, we're getting UDMA 100 or 133, so much faster transfer rates, whereas on a period correct machine from this vintage, you would get around 33 or 66 megabytes a second, which is still plenty, but you will get much faster storage performance out of a Time Machine. The processor is a very big decision that you need to make when building a retro gaming PC. What I'm finding is that processors that are period correct, you will often quickly run out of steam, so to speak. When you approach the year 2000 and games from the early 2000s or late 1990s, I find that the requirements that the games come with, the recommended requirements, are just not sufficient for locked 60 FPS gameplay. So on the Athlon 700, playing Tachyon the Fringe, it will still have some performance issues, and here the Athlon 64 does much better. You will also find that faster CPUs, for example, good luck trying to find a slot A Athlon processor with 1 gigahertz. They are really hard to find, and you will have to pay a hefty premium, whereas on the Athlon 64 you can use the cheapest Sempron CPU, even downclock it in the BIOS, and you will get much better performance. There are also some advantages when it comes to the cooling. Socket 754, you can buy a modern processor cooler and it will be compatible with the socket, meaning it's nice and quiet. The fans are also larger. This one is 70 millimeters, so it's easy to replace. And all that means you can turn your machine, make it really quiet. On the socket A and slot A, well, yeah, you will have to buy a vintage processor cooler. They are not made anymore, and the fans are quite small. This one is a 50 millimeter fan, so it's a little bit harder finding a replacement, and they're running at around 5,000 to 6,000 RPM, so they also make a little bit more noise. Both of these platforms can be slowed down by turning off the CPU cache, and you will end up with the performance of a 386 on both of these platforms. However, here we are stuck with the PCI interface for sound cards. So here having a DOS compatible PCI sound card is a lot harder to obtain, whereas on this platform, the period correct platform, you usually get an ISA slot, and then it's really easy. You can use any of the Sound Blaster cards, ESS audio drive, Yamaha YMF, many options. Let's talk about the monitor. Now on a period correct machine, you definitely want to have a CRT monitor. I have a few screenshots here from the PC Player magazine. A 19-inch CRT was the go in the year 2000, so that's what you're looking at. Availability and pricing is the big challenge, and also these monitors, yeah, they age, they have analog components, they can fail, and yeah, it's just a matter of time until they fail. So in a Time Machine, many of us use LCD monitors, and there are actually quite a few aspects that you need to consider. Because LCD monitors have a fixed resolution, you need to play the games at an appropriate resolution, but not every game supports the resolution of modern LCD monitors. And so a couple of recommendations I can give you. One is buying a 1920 by 1200 monitor and then playing at 1600 by 1200. That's one solution. Another one is a 1366 by 768 monitor, widescreen, and playing at 1024 by 768. And a third option is buying a 1280 by 1024 monitor together with a GeForce 4 or GeForce FX, enable GPU scaling in the driver, and then play at 1024 by 768 or 1280 by 960 for a nice 4:3 aspect ratio. The challenge is if you're playing games that are hard-coded to like 640 by 480, then you have to use the display scaling of the monitor, and you will get an image that's a little bit on the soft side. It's more blurry than it should be. The graphics card is also another big decision. In the period correct machine, we have a GeForce 2. This was pretty much the fastest video card you could buy in the year 2000. This is a GeForce 2 GTS. It has 64 megabytes of RAM and the performance is perfectly capable. It was running Tachyon the range pretty well, but in combination with the Athlon 700, the performance was not silky smooth all of the time. Especially large battles, the machine would slow down quite a bit. On the Time Machine, I'm using the GeForce FX 5200. This one has a 128-bit memory interface, also 64 megabytes of RAM. What I like about the GeForce FX is it has DVI out. This makes my life very easy for capturing. It's also wonderful connecting it to the LCD monitor. You get a very nice, clear image. And another benefit of using a GeForce FX is we can use anisotropic filtering, anti-aliasing. It has more options than the GeForce 2. In terms of performance, even the FX 200 can slow down in Tachyon the Fringe. So here you might want to go for something more high-end. But that is the beauty of going with a Time Machine. You can just go with a faster video card, increase the resolution, turn on all the eye candy and play at 60 FPS locked. We need storage, and for the period correct machine, well, it's got to be a mechanical ID hard drive. We have such a drive here. In terms of capacity, this one is 120 gigabytes, perfect for Windows 98. That's pretty much the maximum capacity. These mechanical hard drives, they emit a sound, they make noises. They've got a platter that's rotating. They've got read-write heads that move around. So all of that gives that authentic, nostalgic sound and feeling that you just don't get with a modern SSD. On the downside is, of course, again, availability and pricing. They're getting a little bit harder to find, especially ID drives with a larger capacity. And reliability. A lot of my ID drives started to slowly tick and click and sometimes take longer to actually get going after turning on the machine. So reliability is a big challenge. And with modern machines, well, we can go with modern flash storage. A 120 gigabyte SSD is a really good option. It's got enough capacity for Windows 98. Very high performance, writing as well as small file performance is terrific on such a drive. But we need to use adapters like SATA to IDE. Some of the mainboards have SATA ports. This one does, but it's got a chipset from VIA and the SATA port implementation is pretty bad, so it doesn't actually work that well. So on such a system, I prefer using a SATA to IDE adapter. However, if you've got an Intel Pentium 4, on that platform, the SATA ports are actually really good, and you can plug this in natively without any conversion chips. You will get excellent performance, no noise. Now, there are some concerns about wearing them out. I spoke to a few SSD manufacturers, and they said even without trim support, they have enough logic integrated to handle all those situations. So apparently it's not an issue. You can do some over provisioning, for example, buy a 240 gigabyte SSD and then just have a 120 gigabyte partition or something like that, and then there will be enough flash cells for the wear leveling algorithm to work with. Let's talk about the sound. I have a few screenshots here from the PC Player magazine, and the Sound Blaster Live was the main sound card at the time. They also mentioned the Oriole Vortex 2 and a card with the Yamaha YMF chip, but the Sound Blaster Live is a really good choice for a year 2000 machine. Because we have ISA slots, we can also install an ISA sound card for DOS games. This is a Sound Blaster AW64 value. I really like this card, and it will give you perfect compatibility under DOS. Now, with the Time Machine, we're a bit more flexible. We don't have to stick with the Sound Blaster Live. We can go with something a bit more high-end. This is the Audigy 2 ZS. It's basically very similar to the Live in terms of EAX support, but it uses higher end components. It has a higher signal to noise ratio, so it will sound quieter, and just overall listening into it, the Audio 2 setters will just sound a little bit nicer. So these are some of the advantages you have with a Time Machine. You can get apart from the future, so to speak, and get better sound. What about input devices? You can go period correct, but you will find that joysticks or gamepads from the year 2000 will be hard to find, and they might not be as smooth or as ergonomic as some of the modern joysticks. And the cool thing is you can buy a modern input device, like we have a Thrustmaster T16000 joystick here, and this is a Logitech Precision gamepad. You plug them into a Windows 98 machine and they will just work. So that's really amazing. And the same goes for keyboard and mouse. With the Time Machine, you can use a really nice Logitech optical USB mouse, a mechanical USB keyboard if you want. So that is the nice thing of the Time Machine. We can have modern conveniences and still enjoy our old games. Depending on the system, the power supply can also be a challenge. On the more modern machine, we have our regular ATX power connector here, and then there's another 4-pin connector there. So this is very similar to modern motherboards. Most of the power will come from the 12-volt rail, which is how things are at the moment. This wasn't always the case. A mainboard from this era, it does have the the power supply connector right here, but the other 4-pin connector doesn't exist. So most of the power here comes from the 5-volt rail. Now on this system, it's not a big deal. The entire system consumes around 60 watts, and modern power supplies have enough power on the 5-volt rail to handle that. But if you are building something that draws more power, maybe a dual slot machine or a Athlon Thunderbird 1.4 gigahertz or an Athlon XP 3200 plus, and that power is drawn from the 5-volt rail, that can be too much for a modern power supply. So those are little aspects that you need to keep in mind. A few comments on Tachyon the Fringe. So this is the game I've been playing on both of these machines, and firstly, it's a really fantastic game. I highly recommend that you check it out. So what system do I prefer to play it on? Well, definitely the Time Machine. So on the Athlon 64, it runs better. I do feel that the GeForce FX was a little bit underpowered. Sometimes it would drop below 60, and playing with VSync you can really notice that because the frame rate halves from 60 to 30. But with the Audio 2, with the nice USB joystick, the LCD screen, and playing at native 1024x768, it was a beautiful experience. So in terms of actually sitting down and playing the game, once you ignore the nostalgic feelings about the hardware, in terms of just playing the game, I definitely had a better experience with the Time Machine. On the Athlon 700, you always feel like that the hardware is just not quite enough, that the game needs something faster. It is playable, but the frame rate is usually around more the 30 to 40 FPS most of the time. So it is still playable, but yeah, coming from an experience of modern games, it's a little bit hard playing games like that. So still playable, but not as enjoyable as on the Time Machine. So guys, there you have it. I really hope you found this video interesting. There's a lot to talk about, and likely you have some other things that I didn't mention, so leave them down below in the comments. I really think this hobby is fantastic, building old computers, or maybe not so old computers, to install Windows 98, MS-DOS, and playing these old games. For me, yes, games is a huge motivator, but I also really love tinkering around with the hardware, and I see a lot of different builds out there, and there seems to be a divide between period correct and Time Machine, but I'm also seeing let's call it hybrid, period correct machines where people then upgrade, for example, the storage to SSD, or they use a modern power supply. So we are making some compromises because the reality is these older parts, they simply do fail. And with the input devices, it's really nice having a nice optical USB mouse and a joystick like Thrustmaster in Wing Commander. It makes a real difference. So if you have something to share and also about the year 2000 and Tachyon on the Fringe and anything else we discussed in this video, as well as requests for future videos, leave them down below in the comment section. I always read your comments. It's something I really enjoy, having a coffee in the morning and then checking my comments on my phone. And yeah, that's it for this one. I really appreciate your support. If you're interested in joining our Patreon community and our Discord server, link down below in the description. And that's it for this one. Thank you so much for watching, and I shall see you soon with another one.